Let's pray. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Come, Holy Spirit, be with us. Open our minds to receive your truth, that we might be able to contemplate you more deeply and reveal that truth to those around us. We ask for the intercession of St. Thomas Aquinas, that we might understand his teaching, and of Our Lady, seat of wisdom. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. If you came for a touchy-feely, hand-wavy discussion about why God might exist, you have come to the wrong place. I'm going to be covering the first of Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways to prove the existence of God, and I intend to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that God exists. Aquinas, which is the city that he was from, not his last name, is arguably the greatest philosopher in the history of Christendom. And he's at least in the top 5 philosophers of all time, if not the greatest. True to his method, I'm going to briefly address some objections before we get into things, but the objections are so varied that I'm going to leave part of that to you guys to ask and the questions afterwards. So, Richard Dawkins is known as one of the four horsemen of the New Atheism. The New Atheism is a movement which tries to resurrect atheism, particularly pointing to the advances of modern science. In his book, The God Delusion, he comments on proofs that Aquinas gives for the existence of God. He spends 3 pages refuting 4 of Aquinas' arguments for the existence of God. And I'm only going to touch on some of the ways that he misconstrues Aquinas' points, and that is in the hope of better understanding when we get to what Aquinas says, why that is different than what you might expect if you were listening to this on a cursory level. So Dawkins didn't realize that Aquinas gives 5 arguments in his Summa Theologiae, which is to say a summary of theology. And it's called a summary of theology. There are large portions of it that are entirely philosophical. They are intended to be summaries of things which are spoken of in other places, particularly in his Summa Contra Gentiles, which is a answer to Muslims, and in his commentary on Aristotle's physics. And that presupposes that you've already studied Aristotle's Organon, which is his 6 works which explain logic. All of these are part of what we would call the Preambula Fidei, which is the preambles to the faith. That is, before you can bring somebody to know Jesus, they first have to understand logic, they have to have a certain understanding of the world around them, and if they're going to engage the faith in a more intellectual way first, from the world around them, they come to the conclusion that God exists. And then it makes sense to say, and there was a guy named Jesus of Nazareth who we have good reasons to believe that he was God, and this is the church that he founded. I need to clarify that Aquinas isn't speaking in probabilistic terms. To propose God as a hypothesis that makes the most sense. And that's what gets attacked as the God of the gaps argument. So Aquinas' proofs, instead of more of a scientific induction process, which is what we would call the scientific method, where you make a hypothesis, you design an experiment, you have the experiment either provide evidence for or against your hypothesis, and then you either prove your hypothesis or you design another experiment to come up with more data. that's not how Aquinas goes about his reasoning. It's closer to the kind of proofs that we do in geometry, which with that kind of reasoning, we demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that God exists. If someone were to look at the proof for the Pythagorean theorem and say, that is a theorem of the gaps, you guys just don't have the science to explain why the lengths of a triangle are in this certain proportion, and that theorem doesn't cut it. That person clearly doesn't understand how geometry works. That's closer to the line of reasoning that Aquinas uses when he talks about the existence of God. In fact, in the broad classical sense of the word science, science is just certain knowledge. And in that sense, philosophy is a kind of science. It does have a different method than the hard sciences, which, as I said, prove by induction via the scientific method. But we still have certainty, just like we have certainty with math. But people do math proofs. They don't do math experiments. Okay, in order to explain Aquinas' proofs for the existence of God, we have to define some terms. So this is going to be the hardest part, I think, to follow of this talk. But if you can give me a little bit of mental caffeine for 5 minutes, we can do a lot of really cool stuff with that. So bear with me. We're going to go through this. So I've given you a handout to talk about these things. The first question that we have to answer is, how is it that we use language? And there are 4 what we call significances of terms. The first is univocal, which is to say something is said in one and exactly the same sense. So red as said of a tie and a rose. It's the same kind of red, just in 2 different objects. The next is equivocal, which is to say completely different things. So bat said of a flying mammal or of a wooden stick. In the English language, it happens to have the same word, but they are entirely different meanings. So that's equivocal. Analogical is a kind of signification that is specific to philosophy, in which there is one focal meaning which is projected on a whole number of objects in different registers. So the word good. Good for a pizza is cheesy. Good for a table is sturdy. It's not an equivocal usage of the term. There's still one focal meaning that's being applied in different ways, but it means a different thing for every single object. And it applies to every object. You can say in a certain sense that something is good or not good, but you can't say that goodness doesn't apply to something. The final is analogous, in which there is a vague similarity or transference of meaning. It's not a philosophical term. So an example would be light as said of evidence and of visible light. There's still a similarity between those 2 meanings. You can't apply light to every single word imaginable. And so it's an analogy, it's an analogous use of the term. With that distinction made, when we begin to talk about stuff, we can break that into certain categories, and that helps us begin to reason about the things. And Aristotle gives us 10 categories by which we can talk about the world around us. The first is substance, which exists in and of itself. And in it, we have these things that are called accidents, things which exist in another, which exist in substances. And there are 9 accidents. Relation, which is the relationship between 2 substances. So father is, my dad is Steve, he is my father. Father is a relation between 2 substances, me and my father. Quality, which it would be, as it is listed later, color, shape, a certain capacity, so he's able to play the piano well. How much, like 6 feet tall. Action, like hitting. Passion, like being hit. When, like 5 o'clock. Where, like in Atlanta, position, like sitting, and attire, like wearing a shirt. Okay, once we've settled that, we've made this distinction between substance and accidents. It's easier to talk about these things when we look at the way in which these questions first arose. So the question is, how do you make sense of change? There's a ball, it's red, you paint it blue, now it's blue. It had a lot of characteristics, and it still has most of those characteristics. It's just this one thing of the color has changed from red to blue. So the thing that stands underneath that is the substance, and the thing that changed is the accidents. So they note that you cannot sense a substance in and of itself. I sense a sturdy wooden thing. Those are attributes that are coming to me from my five senses, and I ascertain beyond that that there is a stand that is having those characteristics. Okay, so that's small changes. Then we have to talk about big changes. So when you have wood and you burn it, it was wood, now it's ash and gas. Now, it's not to say that there's no similarity. There's still a principle of similarity and a principle of difference. And it's very different. There are very different characteristics between the ash and the wood. So how do you make sense of that? Well, the matter, that which exists in a thing and which remains in it, is the thing that underlies both of those changes. The matter is in both the wood before it's burned and the ash and the gas after it's burned. And the form is the principle that makes a thing the kind of thing that it is. That would be the form of the wood or the form of the ash, which takes those carbon molecules and gives it the particular existence, shape, and powers. So wood takes carbon and allows it to be brown and to be sturdy. Ash is chalky.
Stephen, I'll ask a clarification question. So would form be saying a chair is something you can sit on? It has the 4 legs or 3 legs, or however it's designed. It's something I can sit on. Is that form? What makes it a chair?
So a form is the principle that makes the matter into the kind of thing that it is. So the form takes the wood and it causes it to have a certain shape, and it allows it to bear weight. So it gives it certain powers. So it is the principle that makes the wood into the kind of thing it is. Second, I would ask that you hold questions for the end, otherwise we're not going to get through this. On the back, there's also a note of, in addition to the form and the matter, another principle that makes change what it is privation, which is to say the lack of a certain thing. Because for Aquinas, there is no such entity as evil. Sickness is a lack of health. Lying is bad truth-telling. There is malformed nature, but there can't be evil nature in and of itself. Nature in and of itself is always good. It can be warped, but it's not. That is a privation of what it fully should be and what its nature is. Which brings us to, what are the ways that we can answer the question, why this? There are 4 answers to that question. We call them the 4 causes. And we've already touched on 2 of them. There's the material cause, that out of which a thing comes and which remains in it. The formal cause, the form, the principle that makes a thing into the particular kind of thing that it is. The efficient cause, where something came from. So in the case of a wooden statue, the carpenter. So who made it, in a sense? Even if it's not a person, what are the forces that cause this to come into be in time? And the final cause, what is the purpose of a particular thing? So a statue is for the sake of beauty. Finally, once we have that understanding of characteristics, substance, accidents, then we can talk about potency and act. Potency is the ability to have a particular characteristic, and act is actually having that characteristic. Be that having a substantial form, like the soul of a human person animates the body into the kind of thing that it is. So that at the moment of death, when the soul is separated from the body begins the process of decomposing into its constitutive parts, because there is no form, no principle that keeps it having the same shape, existence, and powers as it would otherwise. We can see that a carbon molecule can have many different kinds of characteristics that it becomes a part of. So it could become a part of a wooden stand. It could also become part of a human being. As something takes on more characteristics, it is in potency to receive fewer characteristics. And as it receives more characteristics, it is not in potency to receive other things. Another way of explaining potency in act, potency is what something could be, but it isn't at the moment, which is distinguished from what it isn't and could never be. So I could fly if you added a jetpack to me. That's already I am in potency to fly with a jetpack. Without a jetpack, there's nothing in me that allows me to fly unless you add something extrinsic to me. I am standing, I'm in potency to sit. If I'm sitting, I'm in potency to stand. Okay, with those presuppositions, we can get into the good stuff. The first argument that I'm going to go over is the argument from motion. We're going to explain it very briefly, and then we're going to go into it in more detail. First premise, some physical things physically change. Note that I'm going to use the words motion and change interchangeably because Thomas is speaking of motion in a very broad sense. Note, looking back towards critiques that Dawkins gives, Aquinas is not arguing that all things physically change or that all things change. He's saying some things change. Second premise, principle of causality. Nothing that is changed changes itself. Or, if you will, nothing that is moved moves itself. Again, he's not saying that all things move. He's just saying everything that is moved doesn't move. Not everything that is moved, nothing that is moved moves itself. Third premise, very simple. Physical change is a kind of change. Conclusion, the cause of physical change must come from some principle other than itself. And as you might guess, the most debatable part of this argument is the principle of causality. So, going into a proof of that, we have three proofs for the principle of causality. First proof, we're going to show that a self-moving physical thing is absurd. In this, any claim to merely pass off the self-movement to another agent within the body in question doesn't answer the question. It only invokes the principle of causality. So anytime that I can just say, and this was moved by something else, that's invoking the principle of causality. It's not proving that there's a self-moved mover. So we first have to look at plausible ways in which a thing might move itself. First is that the physical change comes from a part of a thing, like a dog's foot moves the dog, the rest of the dog. That results in a chain of causality in the parts, and that's not proper self-movement. You're just passing it off to another thing. That is, it only answers the question of why one part has moved, and it invokes the principle of causality to do it. So in our analogy, that would be just reducing the question to whether the dog moving itself can be reduced to other parts of the dog moving itself. All that to say, nothing that just invokes the principle of causality, that nothing that has changed changes itself. Okay, so we talked about parts of a thing don't prove a self-moved mover. Now we're going to talk about the whole of a thing, whether that can be considered a self-moved mover. Or, if a thing is a self-moved mover, if the thing which we are moving, so the dog, is the first mover, then when one part is at rest, the whole is at rest. If the dog is the thing that's moving, we're already saying it's not the parts of the dog that are moving, but the whole dog that moves, then when one part is at rest, the whole is at rest. For the being whose rest follows on the rest of another must also have its motion follow upon the motion of another. So think about it. If a book which is standing on a table is necessarily dependent on the table not moving for it to not move, then when the table moves, the book moves. Because we just said, if the book isn't moving because the table isn't moving. Okay, therefore, if a thing is the first mover, and we're talking about the whole of the thing is moving, and one part is at rest, then the whole is at rest. To prove the point further, if it were possible for one part, that is the leg of the dog, to move and another part to remain at rest, so the head is at rest, the leg is moving, then the whole dog is not moved as a whole, and therefore that thing is not a first mover as a whole. Okay. Another point, another way to consider this. Whatever can be in a state of change is made of parts, since at any given moment, each part at a sufficiently small level is in a particular state, even if in a gradation between two states. For example, when I'm coloring paper with a pencil, at a given second, 1 square millimeter is 1% gray, and the neighboring square millimeter is 2% gray. So things that are in a state of change, require having multiple parts in various states. Therefore, a thing which can be in a state of change does not move as a whole. So its movement relies on the principle of causality, and it doesn't disprove the principle of causality. Okay. Now, if a thing is physical, it is extended in space, by definition. And we've just proven that if one part of a thing can stay the same and another can be moved, then the movement does not affect the whole of a thing. Therefore, this kind of movement is reduced to the movement of parts, which we have already shown earlier to be impossible to be a first mover. Therefore, everything moved must be moved by another. So that's the first principle of causality's proof. The second proof looks at the various kinds of physical change that can happen. So there are three kinds of ways in which physical change can happen. First is by violence, that is a push or another force from outside of a thing, like the leash of a dog tugging on the dog from outside of him. The second is from animate nature, that is from the soul of an animal. So we say the soul is the form of the body. It gives a form gives a thing shape, existence, and powers. One of the powers of an animate object is that it can move itself. So it could be coming from the soul of the animal. And then also from inanimate forces like gravity or magnetism. So first, by violence, that movement comes from another object. Therefore, that kind of force endorses the principle of causality. It doesn't disprove it. Second, from animate nature. That kind of movement, that is the soul of the animal, moves the animal, comes from things which give that animal energy, which would be the food or the air, in a way similar to projectile motion, which we will explain later, or by their parents who gave them life. And in that kind of causal change, living things receive life from another. So again, it's not a self-moved mover. Thirdly, projectile motion. That's trying to explain the concept of inertia. So when there's an impetus that comes from another mover, so I'm going to throw a ball. I throw the ball, and then you could shoot me afterwards. The ball is still in motion, but I still am the one who put that ball in motion. So that ball is going to stay in motion until there's a force that acts on it that causes it to stop. But even still, there is something that put it into motion. So inertia does not break the principle of causality. In fact, that kind of force endorses the principle of causality. It's just a little bit of an extension of the kind of violence force that we talked about. Then from inanimate forces. These changes require the removal of an obstacle to occur. So something falls from the table, that's because the table collapsed. And so now gravity can take effect, and the thing that was on the table now falls to the ground. So it's that removal of the obstacle that is the kind of motion that's introduced. So even there, that is a kind of motion that is dependent on an outside motion. Therefore, all three of those kinds of forces have been demonstrated to endorse the principle of causality and not disprove it. Okay, third proof for the principle of causality. From the principles of potency and act. Potency, that is having an unrealized capacity for attaining some act or having a given characteristic. For example, the ability to acquire the habit of knowing geometry and then act the actual habit of knowing geometry. A student cannot teach himself geometry unless he learns either from a book or he reasons from the premises to the conclusions. Now, the act of reasoning is moving from the potency to know the conclusions to actually knowing them. In so doing, the end state is present in the premises in potency. That is, the conclusion exists in the premises in potency, not an act, but it could be if you apply the right reasoning to those things. When the student moves from possibly knowing the conclusions of geometry to actually knowing them, he is moving from potency to act. If the change from the lack of knowledge were to happen by self-communication, that is, because the student were an unmoved mover, that would mean that at one point the student both possessed the knowledge in act and didn't possess the knowledge. That is, the knowledge was both in act and in potency at the same time in the same respect, which violates the principle of non-contradiction. I can't both have a book and not have a book at the same time in the same way. That's absurd. So that kind of unmoved mover doesn't work. If he's getting it from a book, he's reading the book, then that book is a kind of introducing the change from without. So he is not an unmoved mover in that sense. So in both cases, the mover, that is the student, is not a self-moved mover. He's either moving by learning from an outside book or by reasoning. Therefore, considering the principles of potency and act also endorse the principle of causality by the third way. Okay, so going back to the unmoved mover argument. Each mover in this chain of movement is either an intermediary mover or else the first mover, who is unmoved, as we'll address later. That requires proving the principle of non-infinite regress, which states that a chain of movers can't be infinite since no intermediary mover can explain his own motion. So now we're going to prove the principle of non-infinite regress in three ways. The first proof looks at a chain of things, which are moved and movers. If they were a chain of things, they would all be composed of parts, as was proven during the first proof for the principle of causality. By Newton's third law of motion, when one physical body moves another, the mover is also moved. So if A moves B in finite time, then B also moves A in finite time. And if B moves C in finite time, then C also moved B in finite time. The same pattern continues throughout the whole chain, and therefore the whole chain must have moved in finite time, which is impossible since there's no number to which adding a finite number yields infinity. Even if one of the movements was an inertial projection movement, the number of seconds in which the inertial projection force moved the object could also be counted and therefore is finite. Thus, the first proof for the principle of non-infinite regress is proven. The second proof for the principle of non-infinite regress deals with the proof from efficient causality. If the first mover had never moved any other mover, none of the subsequent movers would have moved. That is, if the first domino in the chain of dominoes had never fallen, none of the subsequent dominoes would have fallen. If there were an infinite number of movers, there would be no first mover, since all movers would be intermediary movers. Therefore, if there were no first mover, no subsequent movers could be in motion. But since motion is clearly observed throughout the universe, there must be a first mover. The chain of movers cannot continue on forever. And as we will see later, this proof that we just proven, the second proof for the principle of non-infinite regression, is very close to one of the proofs for God's existence. The third proof for the principle of non-infinite regress is the second proof in reverse order. No intermediary mover, that is middle domino, can move unless it has some prior mover. And if that chain went on infinitely, all the movers would be intermediary and therefore contingent, so no mover would explain his own movement and the movement of everything that it causes. But since that motion is observed in the universe, there must be some first mover. The second and third proofs against infinite regression can also be explained by way of metaphor. Imagine a link of chains holding up an anvil at the bottom of the chain. Each link in the chain explains the suspension of all those links below it as well as the anvil. But if there is not some hook or some other device that explains its own suspended height as well as the links of all those which follow it, the anvil could never be suspended. But since the anvil is suspended, there must be such a hook. You could also look at the analogy of a borrowed book. A lends a book to B and then asks for it back. But B lent the book to C, who lent it to D, etc. If no one has the book, A will never receive it. But if A can receive it, there must have been some person who stopped that infinite chain. Okay, going back to the first proof for God's existence. Since there is motion in the universe, and since nothing that is moved move itself, that's the principle of causality, each mover must be either an intermediary mover or the first mover, since there cannot be an infinite chain of movers, which is the principle of non-infinite regression, there must be some prime that is first unmoved mover. We could also add that it can't be a material mover, since no material thing either moves itself or is in motion without being moved by another, which we have proven earlier in the principle or proofs for the principle of efficient causality. You can also debate about that and debating about God's characteristics, which we are not going to get into. So that's the first proof for God's existence. I promise the second ones are easier. They draw on lots of other things. You guys are doing well. I'm proud of you. Okay, second proof for God's existence talks about efficient causality. So that is, remember, efficient causality is the thing that caused in time a thing to be. So this stand was made by some factory. That's efficient causality. As opposed to material causality, the wood caused this stand to be. That's a valid answer. Formal causality, the shape of this stand caused it to be. Or final causality, this stand exists so that it can hold stuff up. We're talking about efficient causality. We're going to try to prove that the non-existence of an unmoved mover is absurd. So first, consider that every mover is moved. That is, there is no unmoved mover. We're going to talk about a few kinds of movement. First, accidental movement, which is movement that doesn't have to do with the kind of action that caused it. So if I walk down the street and I happen to change from light to dark by the fact that I'm getting burned by the sun, that doesn't have to do with my walking down the street per se. That's another kind of change, it's accidental to the fact that I'm walking down the street. That's not relevant to the causal chain, so we can ignore it. So then we're going to talk about per se movement, that is a kind of movement that is directly relevant to the chain, like a physical push explaining physical motion. If the motion came from the whole of a self-moved mover, like the whole dog moves himself, not just the parts of the dog moving himself, the motion which follows cannot be the same kind of movement, or else the same object would be both in potency and act and in the same respect. That is, he would be potentially moving and actually moving. So there must be some kind of, in the same way, physical motion. There must be some kind of conversion, like the conversion from chemical energy to mechanical energy. We already proved in the third proof for the principle of causality with the example of a student teaching himself geometry that an object cannot be both in potency and act in the same respect. Therefore, movement before and after must be in a different respect, as we said. There must be a finite number of kinds of movements, because you might be able to think of an infinite number of agents, potentially, if I'm talking with a person that I'm debating with, but he's not going to be able to invent infinite kinds of energy or movement. So there's mechanical, chemical, electrical. You're going to come to an end of however many of those kinds of causes, you're going to come to an end of the kinds of causes. So there is a finite number to the number of kinds of movements. To go in a cycle of the kinds of movements would just mean that the same kind of movement, like mechanical, is moving itself through the mediation of other kinds of movement, like chemical or electrical. Therefore, assuming that every mover is moved leads to absurdity, so there must be some first efficient cause. We could go on to prove that the mover is unmoved, even though that's not what Thomas argues, which is to say, the first efficient cause must be absolutely moved. That is, nothing moves him. He doesn't even move. There's no change in him, or else it is also moving itself. If an agent moves himself, like the dog moves himself, the whole agent would have to move himself in its entirety, as was proven in the first proof from the principle of causality. But since such movement requires that an agent be both in potency and act in the same respect, which was also disproven in the third proof for the principle of causality with the example of the student teaching himself geometry. In animals who have a moving part, that is the soul, which moves the rest, that is the body, the soul is moved remotely in several ways. First, it did not always exist, so the life that a dog has, he didn't always have. He had to be created by another. And that causal chain can't violate the principle of non-infinite regress, as was proven earlier. The first self-moved mover must have always been in motion if there were some motion, or else the motion could not have always existed, which is the supposition of this argument, which is being reduced to absurdity. And the souls of living things were created at a particular time, which means that they could not have always been moving. Finally, those things which are supposedly moved of their own accord, like if I decide to go out to dinner, you might say, I am the primary object of, I am the first agent in that causal chain. And Aquinas would answer, no, you weren't, because there was the dinner that you desired. That dinner, in a sense, drew upon you and caused in you a change, and so you desired it. And because of that desire, you went out to dinner. Therefore, the one who desires the object is not absolutely moved. Therefore, the premise of a moved mover, a first moved mover, that is a mover who's moving himself, is proven to be absurd. Therefore, the only conclusion that remains is that there is an unmoved mover. Because he cannot be moved, he can have no potency, but he is purely an act, which is why Jesus says God's name is I am, which was first revealed in Exodus 3:15 in the burning bush. I am. God is totally act and has no potency. I'm not going to go into terribly much detail. It's kind of a side tangent. But there are lots more arguments that you can go into talking about characteristics of God. Okay, that's the first two proofs. Third proof is much shorter. I can see it on this whole page here. Is from contingency, which deals with the necessity of the first cause for the contingent agents which depend on it for their motion. If an efficient cause never caused its effects, those effects would never exist. That is, a book being suspended in the air by a table. The book would never be suspended in the air if the table were not holding it there. So the effects are contingent on their causes. If they have any further effects, then they are intermediary causes. When you suppress a cause, you suppress its effect. So if the table is removed, then the suspension of the book in the air doesn't happen anymore. It falls to the ground. If there were an infinite regress among contingent causes, there would be no first necessary, that is non-contingent cause, which would also mean that no intermediary causes could exist. But there are intermediary causes, like dogs do move. Therefore, there must be some first cause which is not contingent on any other cause, and that is the unmoved mover. Therefore, the third proof for God's existence is demonstrated. There's more I could talk about, but I think that's enough for now. So, what questions do you guys have? I do want to say, you guys were very good at sitting through that. I know a lot of that is really, really dry. This is why nobody actually looks at like the serious arguments, because it's hard. And I wrote this based off of an essay that I wrote in seminary several years ago that I reread and rewrote, more or less, reorganized a little bit right before this. I didn't even read the output of what I wrote before I spoke it to you. So if some things seemed a little rough on transition, that's why. Objections, questions, concerns, refutations? Yes?
Okay, so my first thought is it reminds me a lot of ABA therapy, which is used in special education, where something is always contingent upon an action or a behavior. Like, a behavior is always contingent on something, and it progresses from there. But my question is, that's just a random stuff. But anyways, my question is, so this is probably not correct in my statement, but I'm just gonna say it because so if we think about like our soul and like when we die, so basically it's kind of like our soul, the progression of, like you were talking about, it continues, like nothing is, you used a lot of words I can't remember, but like basically nothing is like absolute, if that makes sense. Like when you go, things progress and things cause momentum to continue on to different states. I don't know if that's my, like trying to put into pieces what I'm thinking, but not this.
So what's the question?
I don't know. Like, I guess, like, what's your thoughts on my statement? I don't know. Like, can you explain what I'm?
Do you mean like what happens to like the motion like continues,
Yeah.
and then like when you die, like does the motion stop? Is that like what you're trying
Like, I
to
know it doesn't stop, but like, I guess what is like
I agree.
Yeah.
I don't know either.
Yeah, that's my kind of where I'm going with it though.
Yeah.
Is like, so when you die, I know it doesn't stop, but
You mean motion doesn't stop?
yeah,
Okay.
like the state of being does not stop.
Oh, you're talking about your soul? Your soul?
Yeah,
Okay. So you're talking about the
Yeah.
immortality of the soul.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, sorry.
So what's the question of how do we know that the soul is immortal?
Yeah,
Yes?
sure, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. I don't know if I have a completely formal
So-
question, but
The next thing that's on my notes of stuff we could talk about is what metaphysics is. So Aristotle, in his progression through the Preambula Fidei, first talks about logic, then he describes the physical world, and that culminates in the argument for the unmoved mover. And I basically just summarized all of that for you in about 40-ish minutes. And the unmoved mover, we said, is not material. So there's some kind of immaterial reality, and now we need a science to be able to talk about reality insofar as both material and immaterial, and we call that science metaphysics. Now, an immaterial thing, we have no reason to believe that immaterial things decompose, fall apart. By the way, there are three kinds of immaterial things: God, human beings, that is, insofar as we have an immortal soul, and angels. And Aristotle does talk about angels. He calls them separate substances, but he does talk about them in his metaphysics. Knowing them just from reason. The only activities that are entirely immaterial are reason and will, which is to say, there is a part of us which, in understanding, that's not based in the body. Now, I can tell you, without going into all the details of how we can prove it, that Aquinas would say that the intellect, even though it is immaterial, interacts with the material powers of the body, which know particular things. The intellect knows abstract universals. By way of analogy, there's no way that you can program a computer to understand abstract concepts. It can react to particular things under certain categories, but it can't understand abstract concepts. There's no way that you can encode truth into matter. Like, there's no way that I can say this matter is truth. It's just matter. Only an immaterial thing can give something meaning. So we have a immaterial soul. We know that material things decompose, but we don't have any evidence for immaterial things decomposing. So if the human being is able to do this abstract activity of understanding, then there must be some part of the human being which is entirely immaterial. And that part then would not go away upon death. And so that's the gist of Aristotle's thoughts on why there is an immortal soul. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I was watching 60 Minutes with my mom the other day, and I was watching 60 Minutes with my mom the other day, and it talked about how the universe has this thing called dark space, and we don't know a lot about what that is. And it also talked about how the universe is constantly expanding and things like that, and how we don't know how many galaxies there are out there. We don't know if there is extraterrestrial life out there, whatnot, and if the Bible says, from the beginning God created light, the seas, darkness, everything, has God always existed forever, or was there a mover before him?
Okay, so a few things. One, we will have a talk later on that talks about evolution, creation, and things related to that in more detail. But we proved in great detail that there is an unmoved mover, and that is God. And if he's an unmoved mover, then there's nothing before him, there's nothing that caused him. So that doesn't say anything about the existence of dark matter, the existence of extraterrestrial beings. I don't have to take a stance on that in order to prove the existence of God.
Alright.
Yes, Glenda.
I will say I've been looking up reputations so that I control you. And all these are really bad.
So the best
Because I
Question-
want to control you, but it's hard.
the best objection against proofs of the existence of God is the problem of evil. How could an all-good, all-powerful God allow evil things to happen? And we're going to deal with that in a different Emmaus night. Okay. Any other questions?